We wanted to have people who were old hands talking about difficult subjects in the classroom, and everyone I talked to said, well, clearly you got to have Meghan and Marina to kick this off. So it's sort of like, okay, we'll have Meghan and Marina kick this off. It's the first of three. The next one's on March 10th with Elizabeth Antis and Greg Freed. And the third of the seminars is on April 7th with Matt Kruger and Mary Troxel. I want to thank you all, and I especially want to thank Marina and Meghan for kicking this off. Okay, Marina and Meghan, it's your baby now, so go ahead.
Great. So yeah, first I want to say that so much of what I've learned has been both through trial and error and from the good assistance of my Pulse faculty community. You know, we're such a community talking about these issues. So I really think there are plenty of people here who probably could easily run this session as well or better than I can, but happy to kick off the discussion. So I've been trying to parse out what I think are some helpful techniques in the classroom for setting a good dynamic after having sometimes done that well and sometimes not having done that so well, especially early on in teaching Pulse. So I'll just get right into it so we have time to discuss later. The first one that I've discovered is really important is just having transparency and communication with students about how it is we go about talking about race. So having lots of transparency. For me, almost every time we end up with a difficulty or we're stuck in the discussion in some place, if I can just be transparent with my students and say something like, wow, it seems like it's really hard to talk right now about racism. I feel that the silence might reflect some challenges. How are you thinking? What are you feeling? That can really open up spaces. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today is trying to be transparent with myself and others about dynamics as they're happening. I found it helpful to have clear pedagogical goals before entering my classroom because there's not just discussions about race or racism or difficult topics, there are different kinds of discussions, right? So I want to think about what do I want the students to learn? How do I hope they're going to be shaped or formed? What do I want them to feel? And what are things I want to avoid? So just to give a couple of examples, I might in one class be wanting my students just to get comfortable with the idea of talking about race. And that's my only class goal. In a different class setting, I might want them to better understand Joshua Glasgow's three ways of looking at what constitutes the nature of racism and to intellectually grasp what he's saying and then apply it to their own lives. In other classes, I might want the students to be a little uncomfortable, to kind of stretch themselves because they've been comfortable for a while. And now my one goal is for them to expand their understanding of how people experience race differently beyond how they've experienced that so far in class. So I think for me to know what I want out of the class helps me to guide the way discussion is going to go that day, better than if I just think, oh, it would be great to talk about racism in some way that helps students to grow, being a little more focused. Especially with the first discussions of race in my class, which I do all year long in Pulse, beginning about a month in, if not sooner, into the program, I start by beginning with acknowledging that conversations about race are difficult and just put that out there as our first point of discussion. So I might say to students, is it hard to talk about race at Boston College? Well, the answer is yes. It's hard to talk about race and racism everywhere in life because it's so impactful on us personally as well as intellectually. And then to ask them why, what makes it difficult or what kinds of things make it harder. So in different classes, students might be really forthright with that and say things like, I don't like it when I, as a student of color, am asked to be an expert on race. Or I'm afraid people are gonna think I'm stupid and don't know anything about racism when I should. Or I'm white and I'm afraid people will think I'm racist. And I try to provide a space where students can talk about and hold and share those things without judgment. Sometimes they don't want to say those things, and quite often they don't want to say those things right away, even if I've tried to create good spaces in other contexts for talking about social issues. So what I might do in those cases is tell little anecdotes about past students who've now long graduated. So I might say something like, well, when I taught Intro to Feminist Philosophy years ago, I had a student who was Black and who reported in class he hated when people made assumptions that he was a first generation college student because, or asked him about how it is to be poor, both things that had happened to him at Boston College, because he was quite wealthy. He had an 18-hole golf course on his home and he had no idea what poverty was like. I might take an anecdote like that, told anonymously about a student who graduated probably a dozen years ago now, and say something like, what are the kinds of assumptions we might be bringing into a discussion? How can we avoid making the assumptions about other people's experience? That can be really painful for someone if someone assumes they know what my life is like, or what my experience of race is like, or my experience of poverty or college or anything else is like, and they don't really know me. And students tend to be receptive to those types of anecdotes or metaphors, or something I'll just put out there. Often white students might be afraid of being thought that they're racist, and that can make it hard for them to speak up and ask genuine questions about a text if they don't understand a point. Give different examples like that. So that's the second thing, is just to kind of trace out with them a little bit some of the ways, I may not have all the ways, that students have a hard time talking about it and why. And then to ask them, what are some good ground rules you think might be helpful so that we can talk about race in a way that is less problematic or less difficult? So they'll give ideas. Some of them have had other experiences of this and will say things like, we can talk about ouches and what are they called? I've forgotten, someone can help me.
Oops and ouch.
Oops and ouches, right. So, if you make a mistake, you should be able to say, oops, I didn't mean that. I want to retrace my steps and say something differently and correct yourself. If you've been hurt by what someone else says, you can articulate that. So let students choose some of the things and have the freedom to set some ground rules. But I also try to say to them that we should expect that it won't be easy and it won't always feel good. That a lot of growth doesn't feel good. And so it's more like if you're learning to dance with a new dance partner, you're going to step on each other's toes some of the time. So if you can think about our conversations about race not as places where you have to perform perfectly, but rather places where the goal is for us as a class to learn something new together, personally and intellectually, and that we will sometimes not get it right, or we will sometimes screw up with each other. And that's okay, because that's part of being a person. And it's part of the legacy of racism that this is so hard and so difficult. That's part of the thing, is that it can be painful. So we want to try to make it less jarring or difficult, but that we have to accommodate that some of that can happen. Think about how do we respond well when that does happen. I found it helpful to have specific texts or questions to which students can connect. So, whenever things go, it is helpful for students to talk about personal experience, but in the context of a classroom like Pulse, where I do have texts about philosophy of race or racism, I find it very helpful to locate specific points of the text that I think will elicit a robust response for students, so that they can think about, okay, why would James Cone say Jesus is Black? He knows that Jesus historically was not African-American. What does he mean? Let's unpack that, and then to kind of through the text get to why would he find this important? And what is the importance of this for his Christology or something like that? Or why would Joshua Glasgow say that racism is not merely behavioral, but also affective and structural? So those kinds of questions can help us to be grounded when it feels like things are hard to manage, because we can't do everything about racism in one class, nor should we try to. It's helpful to just get into something well and to something in a way that helps students to learn. I've also found that trying to practice patience and seek long-term learning over the course of a full year is more important than getting my students to where I want them to be right away. And I think that's the hardest thing for me, actually. I very much want my students to grow a lot in the course of a year. And I want to continue to grow in fighting actively against racism, understanding the problems of racism, and addressing racism. But that's a lifetime's work, I think, for all of us and for all communities. It's not something that just happens. So I think for me, it's been a learning process to try to understand that students are at different places in their journeys on this, that I'm also doing this with them, and that I need to make my choices with students with light to that. So meaning, I can tell an example of something I don't need to have edited or anything, but one year there was an article in the Heights years ago about some very inappropriate racist Halloween costumes and someone defending that those costumes were all right. And I asked my students to reflect on this, and the conversation didn't at all go in the direction that I'd hoped it would go in. It was kind of defending that all Halloween costumes should be fun and it's just play and whatever. And I immediately interceded and kind of pushed back very, very hard with the students who said that, explaining why I thought it was problematic. And what happened was I shut down conversation about race, I would say, for most of the rest of the semester, because the students just felt, and I didn't think I was attacking them. I wasn't name calling, it wasn't hard, I used a nice tone of voice, but they just are so sensitive to being judged by their teacher that it shut things down. So what I found more helpful, and not that it always works and that students don't sometimes feel bad, but is to try to ask questions about where that view came from and why might someone feel differently about it. So just to try to get people to have imaginative empathy. Okay, you might feel like when you wear a sombrero and you act like a person who's Mexican for Halloween, that it's fine, it's just play. But what might it mean to someone? Why is this person who's written a letter to the Heights objecting to it? And what do you think is behind the view that they take, even if you don't agree with it? What might their reasons or experiences be? So to kind of invite them into deepening a sense of other perspectives without just doing what I used to do, which is, well, here's why I think it's problematic. And then the last thing that I wanted to say as a kind of tip, which is just to be really transparent whenever, as I started off saying, transparent when things aren't feeling right. So you know, I had just the other day talking about the incident. There was an incident on campus recently, and I talked about that with my 2 discussion sections in Pulse. And, you know, in one Pulse section that seemed to go very well, students were really sharing about their own experiences, troubled by the incident, knew about the incident, and really were eager to talk about it. And in my other Pulse section, students said hardly anything. It felt like tooth pulling. So what I said to the students was, I feel like for this, it's difficult to talk about and that people are struggling to know what to say. I'm not sure entirely why that's the case, but let's break up and turn off the camera for a minute. And I want you to write out, you know, something about your response, what the first time you heard about the incident, what was that? And then when I get back on camera, I might cold call on you. So decide what you're willing to say. So to give them like that little space to think about it and then decide what they're willing to share in a more public type context. So just to always be transparent and honest and, you know, vulnerable about my own limits and vulnerable about to share with them how vulnerable it is for us to talk about this. And that's okay to be vulnerable. It's part of learning and growing. Meghan, we'll have time to discuss too, but.
So I guess in the spirit of being vulnerable, I'm going to tell a couple of stories that I hope will illustrate some of Marina's points. But it goes to, I think both stories go to how we as teachers bring our whole selves to our classroom, and we're never not who we are as human beings. So the first story is our experience as students shapes our teaching. It was academic year 1998, 1999. I was attending a mandatory workshop as part of my MDiv program at Harvard. I, along with all the other MDiv students, so at least 100 of us, were packed into the large room, whose name I now forget, in the former Andover Hall.
What was Sperry room?
That's the lecture room. It's the one on the other side where they have the tea, or they had the tea.
Okay.
I
forgot.
Yeah. The topics were racism and white privilege. While the concept of racism was not new to me, I believe this workshop might have been the first time, I'm not sure, I ever heard of the concept white privilege. I listened attentively, sympathetically, if not somewhat naively. The atmosphere in the room was tense, stressful. It was, after all, HDS, and you couldn't get it wrong, ever, especially about something as important as racism. Eventually, one of the speakers, a person who identified as white, began to talk about white privilege. And as part of their presentation, they told a story to illustrate white privilege, a story I think they thought was self-evident in its meaning. I remember sitting in that packed room, and as the story ended, I thought to myself sheepishly, I don't get it. I wanted to raise my hand and ask the speaker to explain the story that I didn't quite understand. But there was something about the speaker's own demeanor and affect that strongly cautioned me internally that if I were to ask my question, I likely would have been publicly censured and shamed. I wanted to understand, I really did, but I strongly sense that asking my question would not have been okay. Impact. I continued to think about the story for a long time. It haunted me. Eventually, I think I understood what the speaker was trying to communicate. Second impact. That experience has impacted very significantly how I try to construct the dynamic of my classroom, especially working with undergrads. What I hope to create is an environment in which thoughtful questions can be asked. In the articles for today about Professor Ross's work, there is a sense that shaming is counterproductive to learning, growth, and change. And I want students to want to learn and not shut down. So that's the first story.
Thank you, Marina and Meghan. First of all, before we open it up to everybody, does anybody want to talk to Meghan or Marina about the readings that we were sent, or any questions about those readings? Yeah. Okay, let me start off then. The first thing that struck me this afternoon is how many white faces there are here. Okay. And I think that I was talking to both a very smart colleague in the theology department who is herself an African American, and I just this morning was talking to Vince Rougeau, sending him, as I said to Ruth, an SOB email, like, congratulations, you betrayed us, And I said, well, we're going to do this. And he said, this is very hard because he said, his sense, this is Vince is the dean of the law school who's just named the president of Holy Cross today, but, and is himself an African American. He said, my experience with my colleagues is that the African American faculty at Boston College are exhausted because they're always the ones who are called upon to talk about this. And he said, why is race always on the burden? Why does the burden of race fall on African Americans? He said, Caucasians are white, are racially defined as well. So why is it that we expect our colleagues of color to always bear this? And this is especially a big problem at BC because the faculty at Boston College is overwhelmingly white, and BC has not been successful at hiring professors of color. We're better than we were, but we have a long way to go. I think this is a big thing. For me right now, this is the 800-pound elephant in the room. I mean, we're a bunch of white people. We're privileged upper middle class white people talking about race. And I think for some of our students, this is so clear that it's kind of like, where do you begin? I guess I'll direct that to Marina and Meghan to start off with, like, how do you address that?
Well, so my feeling is that I agree with everything you said, Mark. I think it's also the case that our students, most of our students, are acutely aware of the great need to talk about it. I mean, it's on their minds whether they talk about it with their friends or don't talk about it with their friends. And they don't know where to go to have those conversations. Just last discussion a week ago when I was talking about the incident in MLE with the students, one of the students said, we don't really talk about this for more than 5 or 10 minutes at a time. He was a white student, and I wish we had more places to do it, but I don't know how to do it. So I think students are appreciative. So I think we should be hiring more faculty of color. I think that everyone should be taking responsibility for questions of race and racism. But I think we need to everyone is situated. The way I put it to my students is we're all situated somewhere. We have a role at Boston College, and out of that role, there are things we can do to fight structural and personal instances of racism. My role is as a teacher, and someone else might be doing it in student affairs, and someone else might be doing it at the level of hiring someone. But we each need to think about from where I'm situated, how can I do it? I don't know if that addresses it.
I'd like to add one thing to that, and especially because in philosophy and theology, unless an undergrad transfers into BC from a school that has given them philosophy or theology credit, these two departments see every single undergrad who graduates other than the Wood School. But Wood School students can take classes through MCAS. We will see the vast majority of undergrads in our classrooms. And we were talking, for years, the students were saying they wanted something akin to some kind of diversity training, general umbrella. Well, now they have diversity EDU, but diversity EDU is like just a checkbox that you have to basically satisfy. So they're frustrated by that. Student affairs can do things, but I think as instructors in these two departments where we will see so many students, we have a unique opportunity to hold their attention in ways that other departments just do not and cannot, because they can AP out of so much, or they don't have to take a sociology or psych course. They can satisfy their social science by taking, you know, macro and micro econ.
Byron is his hand up.
Yeah, I thank you guys for such a, the two presentations were beautiful, and I thought they brought up some questions for me. So I went to historically Black college, and we talked about race all the time. It just was normal. No one would, like, these were not tough conversations. And my school had a commitment to being anti-racist. So we routinely, we have some alumni that get upset about this, but we just hand out free scholarships to white and Latino students to just, in fact, at Stillman, 90, I think it's like 95% of the baseball team is white. And we just are committed to not being racist. And so it just, those conversations are just normal. They happen in every classroom. No professor, the majority of the professors, I was an English major. Half of my English professors were white women who studied Toni Morrison. They did womanist scholarship or things. So it just, I see what happens at, and I guess this might be some of the issues with Black faculty here. Like, I'm just surprised at how, some other things that came in my head just now too was just the idea that the Northeast versus the South. You can't live in the South and lie and say you don't know anything about racism. Like, it's just not possible because it's just built into the way we live integrated lives. White people and Black people have always lived integrated lives in the South. So it just, I'm normally just shocked. I'm really shocked at BC, given the nature. This is my first time living in the Northeast, at just how it's never talked about. And how uncomfortable it can be. So that's just some of the things I'm getting and hearing from just being here. Just the difference as a Southerner, the difference is being in an all Black environment that was committed to anti-racism. It's just very different for me.
Yeah, I completely hear that. And I agree with you that there is a discomfort at BC with it. And that, part of what we're trying to do is just break through. I mean, it's not good that the first step is just, can we even have a conversation about it at all? But that is the starting point, the real starting point for me with my sophomores in that context. And even, I think even among peers, trying to talk about diversifying the core. We've been really actively working at that in philosophy, and I ran some summer workshops for graduate students on how to learn how to teach a more diversified core. And it's a real growth curve for a lot of us because we didn't learn that in graduate school. We didn't talk about that, when I was in graduate school in the 1990s, early 1990s. So, it's hard to realize where we're starting from when I wish we were starting from somewhere else. Mark, are you going to field hands, or do you want us to?
Yeah, you can field your own answers. Go for it.
Marianne.
Thanks, Marina. Thanks, Megan, very much. I don't want to get on a soapbox, but I think one of the things that I find the most difficult, I don't know how to unraise my hand, give a second, is the size of the core course that I teach, 38 students. It's way too many. I've been campaigning and yelling to anybody that would listen to me about it. And what they say is, get involved in the new core, and develop a course, that you can teach a kind of team with somebody else. Well, I'm afraid it's too late for me to do that, really. And a lot of the other things I'm involved in, I take a lot of time teaching doctoral students, for example. So, and being on their committees and all that other stuff. But I did try last semester, just because I felt we needed to do something in my classes that I hadn't been really doing before. Was to really have a kind of racism be a kind of a constant thread. And I started out, also, I think it was the last semester, the first week of classes was this scholar strike thing or something. So I told the students that I was going to be a part of that. So we wouldn't have class, but there would be a reading assignment. And also we were going to read eventually towards the end of the class, Brian Massingale, African-American Catholic priest who teaches at Fordham's book on racism in the Catholic Church, right? My course is called Engaging Catholicism. Well, one thing led to another. We were going to do that at the end of the semester, and my TA got COVID. So I was going to have all the final exams, all the final paper. They had a final paper, all this stuff. So we just kind of had it like shoot quickly. So I changed the final exam to basically 2 questions. One that had something to do with what we were doing in ethics, and the other was about this Massingale's book. And he was very critical of what the Catholic bishops have been saying about race, which is basically almost nothing. However, they did put out a new pastoral letter that actually our colleague Sean Copeland was originally part of it. And I think that many of the African Americans, and here again we have a good example. So who's doing the letter? The African Americans, not the white people, for whom, you know, the whole issue really is white privilege or white supremacy. And I just want to interject a personal thing here. I really sort of only woke when I realized that white supremacy is just not about Ku Klux Klan people in the South, and that BC is a white supremacist institution. And I actually said this confession to the students, and because I said, frankly, in my own family, genealogically, I don't want to take too much about this. You know, I have the Hinsdales came over on, like I like to say, the boat after the Mayflower. And basically we're colonialists and, you know, occupied land that was already occupied by Native Americans. And I've done a lot of reading from Jill Lepore and scholars like that, regarding the whole issue. And I've been campaigning for us to start our classes or to start VC events with a land acknowledgement, as much of the Commonwealth countries like the UK and Canada and Australia and New Zealand do. So because that's a consciousness raising thing too. So I guess one thing is, this is why I sort of envy Pulse, is that it has a lower number of students in the class. So do the grad students who are TAing or TFing. And this just can't be done really in a good way with 38 students. Luckily, when I have a TA, we can, and you know, with the virtual teaching that I'm doing, we can have breakouts, or we could have groups within the classrooms. But that's a kind of systemic issue. But I do think we have to kind of name who we are and say that, even use that language. So that's just one comment I have. I don't know that I really, you know, can probably identify with some of the issues they went through fast. I didn't get the handouts till just before the Zoom, so I can't really say much about those, but I look forward to reading them. So that's just kind of my 2 cents about all this.
Yeah, thanks. I do think small classroom size can be helpful. I think, you know, even in a Pulse class, we can have 26 people, and we, you know, in philosophy, we don't have TAs. So I run those 13-person sections, and that's where I tend to have more of these conversations than in the big class. We do have them in the big class, but it does help. I think one thing we can do is what you mentioned already, you know, breakout rooms, having a TA work with students, having students share in pairs. You know, I'm always trying to be mindful about the idea that what happens in a small group is helpful to share to the classroom, but people may want to share differently with 2 or 3 intimate people in a small group than in a big classroom. So I'll often ask them to think about, what do they want to, as a group, pick that they want to share with the class. And that helps to take some of the pressure off of a student sharing something they're not sure they want to share in a bigger context. But I agree, small classes are better.
I think Kristen had her hand up.
Oh, Kristen, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you all. And thanks for convening these conversations, Ruth and Mark. Marina and Meghan, each of your suggestions or something each of you said made me mindful of the graduate students joining us, maybe like the disproportionate pushback on junior faculty compared to senior faculty in the risk-taking kind of practices that you're inviting us to, which I don't think means don't take the risk. But I was in a conversation yesterday about this topic at BC, but not with either of our groups, And someone said, you know, we need to be willing to take the hit on teaching evaluations for broaching these uncomfortable topics, with which I totally agree. But that is so easy for me to agree to with a kind of a tenure privilege. And so I was reflecting both kind of risking the challenging conversations, but also, Meghan, your examples of kind of more personal disclosive vulnerability, I feel like is something that I held at arm's length 20 years ago in the classroom and like am more comfortable embracing today. And so I was wondering about maybe institutional strategies for like embracing, but also protecting and incentivizing this for junior faculty. I noticed this as a theme in early course evaluations. Like, and I know by gender and race, like there's all sorts of studies that folks are facing differences already. But in my first job and in my second job, I started adding questions to the standard course evaluations, because some of what Meghan and Marina, you were saying were my course goals, but are often not measured by university cookie cutter course goals. And even if they make students uncomfortable or exhibit dissatisfaction in some ways, I wanted to be able to measure that. But I just wondered if anybody had other strategies for junior faculty who may be more vulnerable than others of us.
Megan, I don't want to go first necessarily unless you want to, or if other people would rather. I mean,
one way to give permission would be to establish another core learning goal relative to a department and commit to a departmental effort towards anti-racism work, so that the junior faculty or the TFs or whoever have cover. I mean, I sort of have cover, right? Because I teach Pulse. But the question about self-vulnerability is a live one as well. And there are things I'll say now that I would not have said 15 years ago. That is absolutely for sure. But I mean, to the extent that you can use the power that you have to institutionalize it for the department, that would be an awesome thing to do, because then it also creates the expectation. It says this is important. This is not secondary to what's important for students to be learning and for graduate students to be capable of teaching. That's the other piece.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, you know, Pulse does have specific learning goals surrounding understanding and working to combat racism and understanding other social categories like this. So it's a clear part of our course. And I think that I agree with that about institutionalizing that. I would say this, I don't think students typically will give you a negative evaluation for being too vulnerable. Or I really don't think that's very common, actually. I think when I've shared pretty vulnerable things about my own experiences of race, or if my parents were immigrants, or talk about that in some way with the students, they tend to be really interested that I'm a person besides the person who grades them. And I think they can hear from us when we feel a degree of vulnerability about these things. So my sense is that students generally will empathize with you when you do that. You know, the harder things for me is when we challenge students. And again, I think for me, that's part of the cost of fighting. There's a cost to fighting racism. And one of the costs to fighting racism is being willing to ourselves be attacked or devalued or whatever. Like, that's just the reality of calling out racism. I think the question is, like, you know, how do we do that in a way that's constructive for student learning? But I have to, as a white person, be willing for people to not like me, or I know that was what you're saying, Kristen, but just, you know, like, that's part of the reality of this. And yeah. Elise.
Thanks. I just wanted to pose a question, either to Marina and Meghan or to everyone here, about the calling out versus calling in those two articles, and if you have successfully implemented those norms in any way in your classroom, and how successful that has been. Because one of the things I was wrestling with, thinking about the calling out versus calling in, is it seems to risk putting the emotional labor back on the person who is harmed or offended, and is asking for example, the person of color in the class to moderate their own reactions and to kind of attenuate how they speak publicly or personally in addressing harm or violence or offense or whatever. So I don't know if you have done these things in a classroom, if it works, if students are receptive to it. I was just looking for feedback on that.
And can I just add in, that's when I was reading the articles, I was really like, this is asking a lot of Black students to not respond, you know, in ways that show the emotional damage that's being that's happening because of a racist statement. And because of the that's why I brought up my Southernness. As a Southerner, I would not think you don't know any better. I would think you know better than to put on. We had students that would dress up in fraternity, would put on blackface, would dress up in my fraternity's colors or other fraternities' colors, historically Black fraternities, and pick cotton on the front of the unit in front of our fraternity houses, like literally. So you can't. I'm not gonna think that you don't know any better. I think this is a racist act and you know it, and I'm gonna call it out. And so when I hear stuff about what's happening at BC, especially the recent incident, I'm just like, this is just racism. They know it, they know better. And to have to moderate my voice around it, it would be I'm telling you, it would be enraging. Like you would just, it's a lot of emotional labor.
Yeah, when we shared that article, for me, I was actually thinking about the teacher's role and not the other students' roles. So so I think early on in my discussions of race and racism with students, you know, a dozen years ago, I did a lot of calling out very directly about things that are complex. So I think that really something like that, the example you give, of course, should be called out immediately. But there are subtler structural elements to racism where sometimes I leapt to, you know, oh, that's a very problematic statement or something, and it just shuts students down. I think I think first of all, the problem is not, there is no perfect way to resolve this. There's always going to be some cost for somebody. You know, I don't think there's a perfect way, but I think that I do want to, as a teacher, make sure all of my students learn. And so what I can do is to put it out there for my students, even in the regard to transparency, and say, listen, sometimes people say things that are hurtful. I want people to be able to respond and say, that's a hurtful thing, or I think that's wrong, to call people out about their views.
I would just add that I think the disciplines of philosophy and theology can provide fruitful anchor points for analyzing incidents on campus, for example. So look at sort of principles around human dignity or other things like that. So look at the incident itself without necessarily making it about the particular student in an example who has done the thing that is done. To echo what Marina said, my big concern is having something, not my only big concern, there are lots of concerns, but I would want a student to be able to ask a thoughtful question, even if it's a little ignorant, and not have them shut down. So not foreclose the possibility of conversation. So I think it's okay to talk about things that happen out there and to interrogate them. But if you lose the student, you lose the student and they're gone. And it might be really hard to get them back. Yeah.
I think this is a question I would like to hear from other faculty on. I mean, there are a lot of people here who have taught on these topics. You know, how do you find that balance between, on the one hand, keeping students engaged, you know, partly as an anti-racist project? If I have a student who I think isn't well informed in this, I want him or her to grow and to learn their way into understanding race and racism and why it's an injustice and how to combat it. And that can only take place with a certain degree of what Mary Troxel calls a mix of challenge and comfort. I have to attribute this to you, Mary. You know, it's what we want to do with our students, give them enough safe space to be able to learn and enough challenge to push them into learning. And, but it's hard to know where to find that balance. And it requires a kind of practical judgment in the moment that I don't always do perfectly. But Mary.
Oh, yeah, I think it's a great point, and I want to go back. This is, I don't have any answers. This is something I just want to share that I struggle with, is because BC is a predominantly white space and our classes are overwhelmingly white, or they're, yeah, they're in general white. When an incident happens, like what happens, I think, especially in a class like Pulse, it's so important to bring it up and to acknowledge it. And at the same time, I want to protect a student. I want to protect the only Black student in the class from the, possibly well-intentioned, but not very sensitive question. And especially, again, there's the issue of timing that I always struggle with, because, for instance, with the incident in the MLE floor, the students came to my class, the students on campus were still deeply traumatized and in the middle of processing it, the Black students on campus. And so then they come to this classroom that's, where they're the only Black student in the class possibly, and have a conversation about it. And and they're in the middle of just processing it. And it just, that's so, I want to always make sure to protect students from the, the well-intentioned person who's never thought about these things and asked an innocent question or whatever. And that's always and at the same time, not shake my finger and say, don't say, be careful what you say, or shut them down or lose the student. So there's always a balancing act, and
Matt?
Matthew, I saw your hand up. I don't know if you know. Sorry.
Sorry about that. I was trying to figure out the format. I just wanted to add, just kind of also in responding to Byron's comments there, that there's a good distinction to be made between something that's racist and something that's ignorant, right? And I will always call out something that's racist and aggressive, or so ill-intentioned or so ill-formed that it just requires a direct response, and just be like, that's not right. Here's the reasons why. And so I think there's always a room for a certain type of antagonism that is helpful and sometimes productive, and it's risky, and yes, you can risk alienating students, but when you find students making comments which are just ill-informed, then you can say, have you thought this through? And I also, to his point there, the emotional baggage, emotional labor that students of color often find foisted upon them is something, the main thing I want to avoid in my classroom. And I want to be able to make sure that I'm doing the work that they might feel they would be obliged to do in different circumstances, which is maybe me being a little more protective than necessarily I should be. But I think it's important for my role as a facilitator to be like, what would this student experience this comment as? How can I step in and say something there, rather than having to say like, oh, we're having a conversation, you can go. It's like, let me say, here's why this might be problematic, depending on your experiences, depending on your background. So there's distinctions here between going straight for somebody and helping them through a process, depending on where they're coming from, that I think can be useful.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, again, I think it's difficult because I think what we want, I would probably consider racism to be broadly even like structural things that are unconscious, or the ignorant comment is kind of, it's a way that racism has gotten filtered down into something that doesn't even feel racist to the student. So it's difficult because it's so endemic to so much that how do we, not just feel like a person's constantly failing. You don't want your students to constantly feel like they can't learn at all. So yeah, I think there is something really powerful in that well-structured question, finding the well-structured question that asks, okay, if, or I often tell anecdotes about other people, so to protect my students of color, I might say something like, well, I have a friend who's a Black man, and he says every time he's pulled over by the police, he puts his keys on top of his car, he puts his hands on the steering wheel because he's afraid that the police will think he's going to grab a gun. And he's a PhD and an academic, and wears a suit to work. what do you think that, what do you think that might mean? What's different in that person's perspective than in the perspective that was just presented? And how does that show very different experiences of police, even in the city of Boston or something? So trying to find ways, as Meghan said before, to remove some of the pressure from the student of color, not shut down the student who's saying the thing that is not fully informed by a wider breadth of experience and listening, and find a text like we do Elijah Anderson's text White Spaces, as you know, Matthew, and then that we don't, I think that's a very big eye opener for a lot of our students, particularly our white students, to read someone talking directly about white spaces early on in the fall. And then that can become a reference point later on in the class to where they have that intellectual apparatus to go back to when other things crop up like this.
Yeah, I just want to say how helpful this has been for me, because a lot, especially in terms of the phrase that keeps popping up for me is the well-intentioned, and because intentions are so subjective, and my social location, I just wouldn't read it as well-intentioned. I would read it as knowingly just being racist. And so and I'm pretty certain a lot of your students, your students of color, particularly Black students, are probably they're not reading this, a well-intentioned comment as well-intentioned. So this is very difficult, because how do you move back? Like whose mindset are you actually taking when you're establishing pedagogy in order to facilitate these conversations? That's a very difficult question. So thank you. That's just been very helpful.
Yeah, and I take your comment, Byron, to be really important too. I think that's helpful for me to keep that reminder of how differently people perceive things. I mean, it's interesting what you said too about the Northeast versus the South. I do think at BC, the most common response from white students to reading articles like this is silence, like not engaging at all. And that's something I really want not to happen in my classroom. Is I don't want students to be silent in the face of learning about racism, hearing about racism. And that is just common. So it's just there. I am kind of where I try to think about, like, cumulatively, what is the class experience like, and to hit different people at different moments, maybe in the class or something like that. I'm trying to it's hard to articulate even what I do, I don't always parse it apart that way, but to kind of think like, okay, this happened. I know this about this student, this about this student. So what can I do that can help these two people, not knowing what every single student is thinking in the class at that moment. And also, again, I think what Meghan said is so important. We have text to ground us in this. So we have modules we do on race. We have videos where we have students learning about race from someone not in the classroom. I'm actually really intentional about my year of Pulse having people of color as the authoritative philosophers and theologians that they have to read or listen to videos from, so that they also understand that there's a lot of good intellectual work being done by people of color and to augment Black voices. And also, since we have a lot of international Chinese, Korean students, as well as Chinese Korean American students, to try to bring in more stuff about where is the Asian American experience, which I didn't do for a while because I kind of was blind to the need to do that for my students. So I think, it's an ongoing process of figuring out how to hit a diverse group of people at very different places.
Okay, we're running out of time. There are two raised hands, Kristen, and then who's the other person? Oh, Lisa. Kristen.
Oh, I already talked. Lisa can go. It was a small distinction.
Okay, Lisa.
I put my hand down because I saw what time it was. So maybe I'll just flag this.
Permission, but why don't we go another 4 or 5 minutes? I mean, this is an important conversation, so I don't want to break it off.
Okay, but it's something that actually just came up. And it's a situation that I keep finding myself in, which is structuring a syllabus partly around readings on anti-Black racism and white supremacy, which the students can see as soon as they see the syllabus or the course description. So people that are hostile to that are probably not even going to register. But instead of getting African-American students, I've had a few Asian students. And there's not only racism against African-Americans, but also, of course, against Asians, as well as Latinx people currently, but in the past and now exacerbated with the immigration, division that we're having in our country. And so that's a whole other issue, particularly if you have, well, this semester I had a little bit about Asian Americans on the syllabus, but I wound up with no African Americans and 3 Asian students. Some are, well, of diverse backgrounds. These people also are going to have experiences to express, and I want to engage them. It's not directly on the readings, but anti-Blackness is something that's of importance for everyone in the country. But it's just very complicated, and I'm always, I also don't want to target like one Asian student or one Black student from another country as though they have to then discuss and talk. And it can just be very awkward and not quite knowing how not to put a burden on the students and yet invite them to participate and be aware of the diversity.
That's extremely important. Indeed, I had a conversation with John Mahoney. BC claims to be 30% students of color. By far, the largest number of those students are Asian or Asian American, by far, many times the percentage of African Americans and others. So, I mean, that's a huge number. Thank you for bringing that up, Lisa. Kristen,
yeah, there are resources. I mean, when I recognized that was true in my own class, that I needed to bring in more of those resources. I just wrote to friends of mine who do work on philosophy of race as their specialty in different parts of the country and said, hey, what do you think is really good to teach in a court class? And collected a folder, and then I've tried out some of those articles. So, I think I actually do think including articles that directly address it can be helpful. Because and just again, that's part of their learning for me as a philosopher, to learn to recognize that there's a black-white binary, and there's an important reason for that in terms of American history, but that there are Latinx people, Asian American people may not feel like they fit into that black-white binary, and actually they're conveniently located at different places on it, depending on how people want to express white supremacy. That's something I want them to learn. I want them to understand that construct, which is the construct I think is true, but and that they can learn that, that's an important part of their growth in terms of anti-racism. So I think that's a helpful thing, Lisa.
Kristen, I think we sort of rolled on. Do you want to voice your?
It'll be so fast. I just wanted to follow up on Byron's point about how the subjective experience of that could be different. I feel like, I know Brian Massengale, Marian said this after January 6th, and then the Lowell Humanities author coming in a few weeks, Luo, writes this as well, kind of this sense that ensure that somebody's discomfort doesn't take priority over someone else's safety. Like, as much as I really echo the not wanting to shut down or alienate, or you lose somebody at September 15th and then, you've alienated them. I feel like there's some anti-racist language like that again is depersonalized, but could help us strike the balance that Mary was talking about earlier, and all of us are trying to ensure.
4 things. I'm going to call this time. When I was dean, I used to have all my staff meetings standing up. So my theory was no meeting longer than 55 minutes period. So first of all, I want to thank Marina and Meghan for a job well done for the maiden voyage here. You did an excellent job. You set the standard high. Thank you. Secondly, email me or Susie if you want your part edited out. We need to know that. Thirdly, our next conversation is on March the 10th with Elizabeth Antis and Greg Freed. And finally, suggestions. One of you suggested that at a certain point, rather than just having 60 minutes like this, since we're pretty big, we're 18, would it make sense to do 30 minutes of this big group and then have breakout sessions? Would that be better? Would breakout sessions be better for conversation, with fewer Hollywood squares that we're all looking at? We would really want to know your druthers on that. I want to thank you for an important and honest conversation, and I look forward to seeing you again in about 3 weeks' time. So stay warm, and I'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody.